Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a brief disclaimer about today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Our presenter today is John F. Pane, Senior Scientist in RAND's Education Unit and Co-Director of the Carnegie Mellon and RAND Traineeships in Methodology and Interdisciplinary Research, or CMART, an IES postdoctoral training program. Dr. Pane earned his PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University and currently researches the implementation and effectiveness of educational innovations with a focus on math, science, and education technology. His expertise includes the application of experimental and rigorous quasi-experimental methods in education settings. Previously, Dr. Pane led evaluations of an NSF math and science partnership and a school district's one-to-one laptop initiative, investigated data-driven decision-making practices in education, and studied the effects of the 2005 hurricanes on public school students in Louisiana. With that, Dr. Pane, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Justin, and thank you for inviting me to present here today and to all of you who have decided to attend. Today I'm going to be talking about a research project that my team here at RAND is conducting, sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to study schools that they are funding also. This is a multi-year research project that started about 2.5 years ago, and we presented our first interim results last November at the ANALYSES conference at the same time that the foundation released a report on those interim findings. That report is available online, and at the end of the presentation I will give you a link if you're interested in following up and looking at that. Today, what I will do is walk through the similar material that we presented back in November. I encourage questions along the way. If anything comes up, I'd be happy to pause and answer those questions. So what I will do today is first introduce a little bit about the study, both the types of schools we're studying and the methods that we're using, and then go through just some key interim findings from the first 2 years of the study. And those fall into 3 categories: school design characteristics, student and teacher perceptions of the schools, and student achievement results. Like I said, these are selected findings. There are much more in the report, but to keep the presentation brief, I just picked out what I consider to be the most interesting or important findings. And at the end, some brief conclusions and implications for further study. So first, the Gates Foundation has a working definition of personalized learning that is on this slide. They define it as systems and approaches that accelerate and deepen student learning by tailoring instruction to each student's individual needs, skills, and interests. Students have a variety of rich learning experiences that collectively will prepare them for success in the college and career of their choice. And teachers play an integral role by designing and managing the learning environment, leading instruction, and providing students with expert guidance and support, helping them take increasing ownership of their learning. And so, one thing you'll notice is that while personalized learning is often associated with technology, this definition doesn't explicitly mention technology, but of course, technology does play a crucial role in actually making it possible to realize this objective of personalized learning. Moreover, the foundation has observed 4 common or frequently encountered approaches that are adopted when schools do attempt to implement personalized learning. And I'll go through those 4 here on the next 2 slides. The first are learner profiles. In learner profiles, teachers have an up-to-date record that provides them with a deep understanding of each student's individual strengths, needs, motivations, and progress, as well as the goals, so that the teacher is informed of the student's learning continuously and is always updated so that they know what the student knows and what they need to work on next, for example. The second common approach is personalized learning paths, or personal learning paths where all students are held to high expectations, but they can follow customized paths that respond and adapt based on their progress, their motivations, their goals. So, for example, a school might use weekly updates about students' academic progress and interest to assign a unique schedule that includes a variety of learning experiences or modalities. It could include project learning, small group work, independent work, or one-on-one tutoring with a teacher. And so each individual student would have an individualized plan that is updated frequently. The next common approach is competency-based progression. So instead of having students sit in a course for 1 year and then be done with the course at the end of that year, regardless of how well they're doing, in competency-based progression, each student's progress toward goals is continually assessed, and they advance and earn course credit only when they've demonstrated an adequate level of mastery, whether that's sooner or later than a year-long attempt. And so all of the progression is based on competency and not seat time. And then the fourth common approach is flexible learning environment. The student needs drive the design of the learning environment, and that includes all operational elements, including staffing, the utilization of space, how time is allocated. All of these respond and adapt to support the students in achieving their goals. Schools might give teachers more time to deliver small group instruction. In some schools, students are only present 4 days a week, and the 5th day is so that teachers can collaborate and plan. They might recruit parents and community volunteers to provide after-school tutoring and so forth. Now, these are 4 common approaches. The schools in our study vary in whether or not or how many of these things they implement. The interim
Hi, John.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, John. It looks like we have a It looks like we have a question from John Watson, who's asking whether a personalized learning path typically applies at the course level, meaning a path through the course, or at the student level, meaning that the student has a path through multiple courses.
I think that varies by the school designs and the particulars of how people are attempting this. In some cases, courses are very structured and the learning paths are within courses. In more extreme cases, the pure definitions of courses the boundaries between courses might become more blurred, and students would be making pathways to meeting a set of standards, but not necessarily within the context of a course.
We also have another question here from Kevin Heller, who asks, what sort of technical staff are organizations hiring in order to build these personalized learning paths? Or are commercially available LMSs now being built with PL paths baked in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we're seeing that schools are struggling with staffing. They are, of course, you need a lot of technical support if you're going to have a lot of technology. You will also see, I think in the report, if not in my talk today, that there are some complaints that some of the technologies, such as learning management systems, are not quite up to par in terms of really enabling schools to realize their original visions about this. So I think there's work to do here. I don't think that there are clearly winner systems or gold standard systems that can do all of this. And it has put a lot of burden on the staff to be able to manage things. So I'll continue to interrupt if there are more questions. The study that we're presenting today has 23 charter schools in it. The larger study actually has many more schools in it. The schools are receiving grants either directly from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or through indirect involvement of the foundation. For example, there's a Next Generation Learning Challenges initiative that is operated by EDUCAUSE, and schools that are funded by that NGLC are indirectly being funded by the Gates Foundation and are also among the schools in our evaluation. So the 23 that are in this presentation are schools that, as of spring of 2014, have been implementing personalized learning for 2 years and also had 2 years of assessment data that we could utilize for outcomes analysis. As the study goes on, that set that we'll be reporting on will increase. We'll have much richer set of schools in terms of where they're coming from, how many there are, and how long they've been implementing personalized learning. As I said earlier, the ones that we have in this report are pursuing a variety of personalized learning practices. They all participated in one way or another in competitive grant programs to get these grants from the foundation, where they wrote proposals. And part of these programs was to encourage innovation and new ideas about school models. And so there's a variety of quite a variety of models that were proposed and funded by these programs. These are all, this year, they are all charter schools, and they are all urban schools serving minority and low-income students. Large fractions of the students are eligible for free or reduced price meals, as well as being children of color.
Hi, John. We have a question from Joe. Sorry about that, John. Looks like we have a question from Joe, who asks whether these schools were initially designed as personalized learning schools, or did they undergo some sort of reform to get to that stage?
These were all, well, let's see. So the Next Generation Learning Challenges schools are all new schools that were starting out, new charter schools. Some of these other grant programs are to charter school management organizations that have already been in operation prior to receiving these personalized learning grants. And so in those cases, they were adopting some new innovation or initiative within an existing school. So the research study collected data on implementation of these school models and outcomes. As you can imagine, it's a challenging research study because these schools are scattered around the country. There are not obvious control groups for comparison purposes. And so all of our data collection suffers from the challenge of finding comparative data to really understand, how does what we're seeing in these schools differ from ordinary practice. And we're working to try to expand the comparative abilities that we have. And in a moment, I'll describe what we did in terms of assessment. But for many of these other measures, we really have only within treatment data. And so we can describe what's going on, but we have little information about, for example, how teachers would have responded to the same survey items had they been in more traditional schools. The data collection includes student performance data from the NWEA Measures of Academic Progress, or MAP assessments in math and reading. And all the schools that are in this analysis administered that assessment. We also administered teacher surveys to all the teachers and teacher logs, which are daily, very brief daily surveys several times throughout the year, where we ask teachers to just spend a couple of minutes telling us about their interactions with one student each day in order to get sort of a glimpse of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in the classroom that might not be as obvious or as measurable on a year-end survey. So we did those teacher logs for 10-day periods 3 times throughout the year. And then we also did a larger, more comprehensive survey at the end of the year. And then we also surveyed students 2 times in the year, at the beginning of the year and the end, asking them about study habits, attitudes toward learning, and opinions about their school, and their levels of access to technology and other topics. We also conducted 1-hour interviews with an administrator in each of these schools to get information about the school design and other sort of matters about, how they were planning to implement personalized learning. The larger study, we're also doing case studies. This sample of 23 schools doesn't have a large enough representative in case studies to really include much information here, but when we produce results later, there will be some more comprehensive case studies in a handful of schools. For the student achievement analysis, we used a method called virtual comparison groups to try to enable a apples-to-apples comparison of learning growth. And here's how we did that. The testing company that produces the MAP assessment, NWEA, Northwest Evaluation Association, has a large database of testing data from assessments that have been administered around the country for the past several years. And they offer a service where we can draw a matched group of students from that database for comparative purposes. So for each student that was in our study, we used their MAP assessment data and found a set of matching students in this large database. And the matches were based on several student and school level characteristics. So for students, the student had to be the same gender, had to be in the same grade, and had to have scored similarly in the fall of 2012 on the MAP assessment, which is the beginning of the period of time that we're measuring here. So they started out with sort of the same pre-test score and had the same gender, same grade. And also they had to be in schools that were in the same type of location, in this case urban, and with a similar proportion of low-income students. And so from the entire database, the assessment company found the ones that could match our students and then did a random draw of 51, of at least 50, of up to 51 students for every student in our study. And so we have this large comparison group then that has been matched to these students. And the assumption here is that these students are coming from more traditional schools, but we really know very little about the schools that these students are coming from because there's very little identifiable information in this database. And so we just know that it's sort of nationally representative of schools administering the MAP assessment. And of course, anytime you do this kind of match comparison group, there are important caveats about, while these 51 matched comparison students might look to be well matched to our students, there's always the possibility that there are not other characteristics that differ that we're not seeing in the database, and that could actually affect the results. But this is the best method that is available in a situation like this where we cannot do random assignment. We don't have access to schools nearby or in similar neighborhoods in the same school district to administer assessments. So we really have to rely on some method like this in order to get any kind of comparative data. So now I'll briefly walk through several categories of findings from this study, starting with some things about school design characteristics. In three categories: the school design characteristics, the student and teacher perceptions, and the academic achievement. I'll present some high-level findings, and then I'll dive into a couple of the high-level bullet points, and then leave it to those who are interested to go to the report for more details if they are interested in other topics that I'm not touching on today. So regarding school design characteristics, we found that there are a variety of approaches to personalized learning. As I mentioned during the introduction, these schools are implementing a variety of personalized learning pathways, and we find that in the data. But some common practices emerge. For example, teachers report widespread use of competency-based instructional practices. So they are attempting to really evaluate students and move them along based on their mastery of topics, and not trying to just force them to meet some kind of preconceived pacing guide for how quickly the students need to learn things. Nearly 2/3 of the teachers reported the use of learning profiles and learning plans. And teachers reported frequent data usage and relatively high levels of satisfaction with the data that were available to them to make the kinds of judgments that they need to make for personalizing learning. There was extensive use of technology, but this varied widely, even within the same school. So this depended on the teachers, it depended on the particulars of the class, how much technologies were being used. Regarding competency-based learning, most teachers reported several things. They reported that students are aware of the goals they're expected to meet, that students have opportunities to work at different paces, and different students can work on different topics or skills at any particular time. Teachers reported that they were devising strategies to help students track their own progress and to take control of their own learning. And when we looked at the daily instructional logs, teachers commonly reported focusing on student mastery of content and student critical thinking skills. In terms of data use, a majority of the teachers reported that they had access to data at least weekly or more often on specific students achieving mastery or needing extra assistance, on non-achievement outcomes such as behavior, attitudes, or motivation. But in general, this data were only available for mathematics and language arts and not for other subject areas. The teachers also commonly reported that.
Hi, John. Sorry to interrupt. It looks like we have another question here from John Watson. He says, is it reasonable to think that all teachers are going to tend to say that they do these things? He knows that you discussed the limitations of the study, but he can't imagine in any school saying, for example, that they move students along whether they understand the material or not.
Well, that's a good question. We can't say for sure that these same results wouldn't come from other schools that are not implementing personalized learning. Another project, I do see teachers complaining that they're, forced to stick to pacing guides, and when they try to implement technologies, they feel like they can't. Technologies that are designed to enable more personalized learning or mastery-based progression, they often do complain in my other studies that that they can't stick with the technology because the pacing guide and the end-of-year assessment is forcing them to basically keep kids moving along. So I do in my research experience see that teachers struggle with this. So I'm not sure that they would always report that everything's fine and that they're not progressing kids along. But we can't say for sure because we don't have comparative data asking this exact question to similar teachers in other more traditional schools. Okay, and Justin, I have to apologize. There's a delay, I think, and so when you start talking, I don't hear it for a little while, and that's why I speak. So I will stop when I hear your voice. The other thing that teachers report is that they use data to support instruction, including tailoring content for individual students, grouping students, identifying topics that require more or less emphasis in instruction, reflecting on and discussing learning with students as well as in conversations with other teachers, and to make decisions about tutoring or other educational support services that students may need. Now I'll move to the key findings about perceptions of students and teachers. What we found here is that these 23 schools share a strong focus on student learning and high expectations. But again, maybe as always, we don't really know what kinds of survey responses we would get in other types of schools. Teachers reported working in a supportive working environment that is consistent with a high-performing school. They reported satisfaction with the ability of the physical classroom environment to support personalized learning in some cases, but not in others. So there are some novel ideas about how the classroom environment should be structured to support personalized learning. Some schools are experimenting with breaking down walls or having big open spaces, and they've reported mixed satisfaction with that. Some feel like it's been a good choice. Others are pulling back from that idea. So I think that people feel like the physical environment might not, of traditional schools might not be directly conducive to personalized learning, but they haven't quite figured out what the best configuration is just yet. Teachers reported generally positive perceptions about their ability to use technology. We didn't hear a lot of complaints about things being too hard to manage, or the technical competence of teachers not being up to par. But generally in these new schools, they hired new staff, younger staff. There's a lot of TFA teachers in these schools. So I'm not sure that more traditional schools with more mature teaching staff would have similar kinds of experiences in terms of technology perceptions of the teachers. Some obstacles that were reported relate directly to personalization, but mostly the kind of challenges that we're hearing about are the kind of challenges that we believe are present in most schools like this in urban situations. There's a lot of student behavior problems, especially at the higher grade levels. That's probably the one most commonly reported problem, but it may not have anything to do with the structure of these schools. Although you could imagine that technology could offer children opportunities to get off topic or not necessarily be on task. And so I think there is some work to be done to understand how a technology-rich, personalized environment works and interacts with behavioral issues. Regarding the school environment, teachers reported positive perceptions of working conditions, professional development and training, and overall support that they were receiving from administrators and colleagues. They reported that the teachers in their school were highly focused on improving student learning. The students reported being engaged in school and described the school environment as supportive, but yet having high expectations and a positive climate. Regarding technology support, a majority of teachers reported adequate access to high-quality technology-based curriculum materials, and they reported that they received professional development that helped them use technology in the classroom. They also reported satisfaction with the student data and student assessment systems and how those systems support personalization. However, a majority of teachers said that they needed more information to help them better assess student mastery. And finally, the third major area is student achievement. What I'll be showing on the next few slides is that we are finding relatively large positive effects in math and reading in this analysis that we did of the 23 schools on the math assessments. In elementary and middle schools, the scores were substantially higher relative to national averages, or the gains were substantially larger relative to national averages. And we found relative growth rates were higher for students with lower starting achievement. So kids who are starting out behind seem to be catching up, or the achievement gap may be being closed in these schools. And these results were widespread across schools, with more than about 2/3 of them having statistically significant positive results. And a variety of additional analysis provides some insights and raise questions to be explored in the third year of the study. Now, in these charts and graphs that I'm presenting, I'm going to be benchmarking, actually reporting 3 different kinds of results. One is how these students in these schools perform relative to their virtual comparison group, as we described earlier. But we will also look at how the students in these schools benchmark against national averages, and also look at the rate of growth, not just in terms of effect sizes, but how quickly they are learning. So this first chart is effect sizes. So this is basically measuring the difference in the post-test, or the spring 2014 scores relative to the virtual comparison group that was matched to these students on their starting scores in the fall of 2012. In the top left cell, when we average or look at the effect across all 23 of the schools in our study, we get an effect size of 0.41 in math and 0.29 in reading. All the numbers in this table are statistically significant after we performed adjustments for the multiple hypothesis tests that we're doing here. These effect sizes of 0.41 and 0.29 are standardized effect sizes reported across research studies and comparable across research studies. And these are relatively large effect sizes that are, many intervention studies do not find effects this large. Some charter school studies find effects in this range. For example, studies of KIPP schools sometimes find effects in this range, but these are large positive effects. And as a benchmark, that 0.41 in math is equivalent to moving a student who would have been in the 50th percentile if they were in a traditional school to the 66th percentile in one of these personalized learning schools. And then if you look at the grade range values, you'll see that the effects are larger at the lower grades, and they get smaller at the higher grade levels. This is also commonly seen in other research studies. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these higher grade level schools are not performing well. It's just a commonly seen artifact of this type of analysis that effect sizes tend to be smaller at higher grade levels. Now, as I said earlier, this next chart is looking at a different kind of comparison. Now we're looking at national averages, not the virtual comparison group. And what we're showing in this table is, in this chart, is that the blue bars are where these students in our schools stood at the beginning of the period, that's fall of 2012, relative to national averages, and it's on a percentile scale. So these students are well below national norms at the beginning, and then the red bars are how these students were performing in spring of 2014 at the end of the 2-year period. And you can see that in elementary and middle schools, they went from well below national norms to above national norms. In high schools, they exhibited gains but did not quite reach national norms. In reading, the story is similar, maybe not quite as large. Again, we see that the students are starting well below national norms. In elementary schools and middle schools, they are catching up to reaching national norms after 2 years. And of course, maybe these effects can accumulate over longer time periods for them to get even higher. And then in high school, in this case, they also reach national norms by the end of the 2 years. Now, in this chart, we're going back to comparing against the virtual comparison group. This time, we're looking at how the gains in the students in the 23 charters, the personalized learning schools, compared to the gains over those 2 years in the comparison schools. And these are the percentage of students who exceeded their peer group, or the 51 students who were matched up with them. And we've divided it into quartiles based on where these students started out. So let's look first at the bottom quartile. These are students who started the 2-year period at the low end of the range. So these are the lowest performing students. And we see that by the end of the 2 years, 70 to 80% of them had outgained their peer group, that virtual comparison group. And there were also large fractions outperforming their peer group in the second quartile and the third quartile. In the top quartile, it's closer to 50%, which is what we would expect. If there were just random fluctuations, about half of them would outperform their peer group and half of them would underperform the peer group. So that top quartile is sort of close to expectation. Maybe the third quartile is close to expectation, but those bottom 2 quartiles, we're seeing far more students outperform their peer group than we would expect just by random fluctuation. And that's an encouraging finding for closing the achievement gap. Now we're looking at effect sizes school by school. And so the dark vertical line is the average effect across all 23 schools. This is mathematics, so that's 0.41. And you can see that all the dark blue bars are schools that had significant positive effects. Some of them are even far outperforming that average effect. There were a couple of schools that had significant negative effects and a few that were close to 0 and not determined to be significant. And again, all these significance values have been adjusted for multiple hypothesis tests, and they're still significant at the P5 level.
John, I think we have a couple of questions about the previous chart, the quartile chart. Joe asks whether or how, if at all, that varied by grade level. And then John Watson asked whether that growth was referring to proficiency or national averages on the MAP tests.
The growth this growth is basically looking, so the MAP assessment is a continuous growth scale across the entire K through 12 spectrum, although the assessment really works well, like maybe up to 10th grade. In the highest grade levels, the assessment may not be a great measure. But on that continuous scale, we're basically looking at the growth on that scale between the students in our study and the students in the virtual comparison group. So if the students in that database are nationally representative, then we have a nationally representative sample, but I'm not sure that's the case. I think that the schools that administer the MAP assessment tend to be charter schools, tend to be urban schools, and so we really aren't able to say anything about national representativeness on this particular comparison. And then the other question, did we look at this by grade levels? I don't have a chart of that, but I'm pretty sure that we see greater gains in the lower grade levels, just like we see larger effect sizes in the lower grade levels. These bars would be higher if we focus solely on elementary schools, I believe.
Thanks, John. And we do have, I'm sorry, I misread that question from John Watson. He asked whether those 2 lower quartiles are truly learning enough in a year to eventually reach proficiency. He says the reason for the question is that the MAP comp group is low achieving, so outperforming that group might still not actually close the achievement gap over time.
You're right. I mean, what we can say here is that these schools are doing better than their peers, their peer schools, by a significant amount. How long it would take to actually close the achievement gap is not really something we're measuring here. We just know that they're making some headway. That's all we can tell, is that they're closing the gap to some extent, but I don't know whether or how long it would take to fully close that gap.
It looks like it's quiet for now. Thank you, John.
This next slide just shows. Okay, thank you, Justin. This next slide shows the similar chart for reading. Again, many of these schools have solid blue bars, which mean that they're statistically significant positive results. One school with a statistically significant negative result, and several that are so close to zero or small that we can't really say whether they're doing better or worse. So to conclude the student achievement piece, we tried a few things to check whether there was some kind of selection issue going on here. So the schools in our study are schools of choice. They're all charter schools that parents are making an affirmative choice to send their students to. And we worried for a while that there was some hidden difference in these students relative to the student population in that large database, where they were not necessarily schools of choice. And so what we did was we did a second draw from that database where we only considered comparison students if they came from other charter schools or other types of schools of choice, so that we could see whether that parental input element was influencing these results. And when we did that, we got similar results. So we think that this is not a matter of family involvement in the student's education, that even when we try to control for that, we get positive effects in these schools. We also looked at a conditional growth model, which is a model that the assessment company has for growth that takes into account the starting point on the assessment and the student's grade level, but does not consider school characteristics. So it also makes a prediction for how much growth a student would make based on national norms. And when we compare our results against that, these schools do even better. So our virtual comparison group method seems to be setting a higher benchmark in terms of a higher bar for these schools to show that they're outperforming the comparison schools than this other growth model that the testing company has. So these two, sensitivity analysis kind of support, that these are probably real results. At least we're able to rule out a few ideas about, what might be these in a positive direction. But we're continuing to look at this and trying to figure out ways that we can get a good handle on, whether these are real large effects. We're also looking at how student population changes over time to see whether there's any kind of attrition or anything else playing into this that might have to might have effects on school level measures. We're also trying to examine whether these large growth rates persist from year to year. That is, once kids get above national norms, do they continue to grow? Do they continue to grow at fast rates? And that can play into the question of whether staying in a school like this would close time.
Hi, John. We have a couple questions and a couple comments as well. Catherine asks what your best interpretation might be of the negative effect on those last two charts that you showed.
Well, whoops, went the wrong way there. Yeah, so I assume Catherine is asking about a couple of schools where we're seeing negative results. We are, trying to do some work to relate attributes of these schools and implementation data we're collecting in these schools to the outcomes. And so part of our future analysis will be trying to understand what the components are of these most successful schools, and perhaps what is going on in some of these schools that aren't working. But we don't have.
And then we actually have another comment from Kevin who says, regarding to making affirmative choice to attend the charter school, he says he knows this is beyond the scope of the study, but would be interested to see a map of home addresses and distance from the charter school versus distance to the nearest non-charter school. And then we also have another question from Catherine, who asked whether NWEA has actually seen the results yet, and that it may encourage them to include some school characteristics in the future.
Okay, thank you. So Kevin, we don't have any personal information about these students, so we wouldn't be able to do that kind of mapping exercise ourselves. We're working with completely de-identified data sets here, other than the few demographic characteristics that are in there. But I do agree with you that that would be interesting. Catherine, NWEA, at least some of the researchers at NWEA have seen our results, and we've been engaged in discussions with them on a variety of issues related to how to improve the kinds of analyses we're doing, different kinds of growth models, and a variety of other things and challenges that we're seeing. And it's a very complex set of things. Of course, when you look under the hood at any of these analyses, there's a lot of messiness, and it's true definitely here with these, with the map assessment. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily perform that well at the highest grade levels, and we face a lot of challenges to come up with a alternative. The NWEA also has concerns about how seriously students take this assessment and how that may affect results. And they do a lot of thinking about this. Of course, that's what they do all the time. And so, but they are aware of our results and have been discussing them with us. And so I will conclude, and then we can continue with questions. As I mentioned, these are just interim findings on an ongoing study. We're expecting to have a similar report to the one that was released last November in about a year. And then following that, we will have a more comprehensive report that will have a lot more detail, even for schools that weren't necessarily implementing personalized learning for 2 years like we had the constraint in this study. So we have close to 100 schools in the study overall. And as I mentioned, we have case studies going on in some of them, and so we're planning to be releasing over the next year or two a lot more information about what's going on in these schools. What we have here gives us cautious optimism about the implications that these have about the concept of personalized learning, and we're really looking forward to seeing the next year's results and how this evolves over time. And I'll put up a short URL that will take you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation website, where they have the report. They have an executive summary of the report. They also have a summary of our teacher survey data. If you follow this link, it should take you there. And then I'll open it up to any remaining questions for the time that we have left here.
Looks like we have a question from Jill, who asks, did your study explore at all the success in transfer of ownership over learning to students? Also, did your surveys look at engagement factors that go deeper than just achievement on tests?
Yes, to some extent, yes. We do attempt to measure on our survey a variety of non-academic constructs that such as grit or mindset. And we do have questions on there about students taking ownership of their learning and their attitudes about learning and their future. we do have more of those results in the interim report, and of course, as we release results, there will be more comprehensive results there. We are also considering, this is not definite yet, but we are trying to arrange for a nationally representative administration of this student survey so that we would have some comparison information so that we can see whether the things that we're measuring in these schools are different than what is typical nationwide. We're working with the Gates Foundation on trying to make that happen this spring so that a national sample would take that same survey that we're administering to our own students in the study. What I can say is that on some of these non-academic measures, we are not seeing gains from fall to spring. So the values that we see, for example, on the constructs of grit or mindset are the same in the fall as in the spring. So we're not seeing growth on those measures over time, but it's unclear how sensitive those measures are to growth, and I think it will be very informative to have some.
Great, thank you. And Joe also asks how your design accounted for student attrition.
So in the analyses that we do, we did examine, we basically have a student identifier that is assigned by the testing company. It's not related to any other identifiers of the student, but using that identifier, we can examine how many students are present or lost after 1 year versus 2 years in the study. And to the extent we were able to do that so far, we're not seeing a lot of differences in results when we account for attrition. But we will be looking at that more comprehensively, especially when we have longer periods of time, like 3 or 4 years of student involvement in student assessment data, where we'll be able to see whether they stay in the school. We will be trying to understand how much attrition there is and whether that is influencing the growth.
Great, thank you for the question, Joe, and thanks for the answer, John. We're coming close to time here, so if you do have any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window, and I will be sure to address them to John, given that we have time. And John, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, I enjoyed the opportunity and the very interesting questions. I appreciate it.